child, that the fragility of all existence, and that this world has the potential to be lost, like his three children have been lost, like drops of dew in the morning. Being a Pure Land Zen Buddhist, Issa recognizes that Zen teaching that dwelling on the ephemeral world will only lead to suffering. As being ephemeral, it will leave us like drops of dew. But despite this, there is that lingering resonance of the final line, and yet, signaling Issa's resistance to this Buddhist wisdom. He is saying, I know this world is ephemeral, but the suffering I feel at the loss of my child is real. And although the world we experience is this mundane world and not the ultimate reality of existence, this is the world that we have, and there is still pain here. And this pain is real, and the loss for my child is real. And that loss cannot be reconciled or dismissed by a religious meditation or metaphysics. And constantly oscillating between sorrow and the possibility of transcending sorrow, the promise of the world to come, and our material and emotional attachments to the world that we exist in, the pain that stems from our attachments to the world, and the pain of losing our attachments to this world. All of these become centered in this one moment, and that is the epiphany in this poem. But it's an epiphany that leads to a new realization of the world that is not simplified, but becomes more complicated. And for Ray Armantrout's haiku epiphany, it's not centered in the same way it is in Issa on religious conviction. Despite Ray Armantrout's early interest in East Asian poetics and thought, growing up in an evangelical family ultimately led her towards a distrust of religion. Such self-skepticism, John Talbot and Timothy Murphy conjecture in Greil Marcus's A New Literary History of America, grows partly from Armantrout's early years in San Diego, at that time a conurbation of Navy bases, prefab houses, transplanted Midwesterners, and brand new Anglo suburbs. Page 1032. As Armantrout confides in her memoir, True, collected in her book, Complete Prose, that this fundamentalist upbringing was, fundamentally at odds with her inquisitive nature, and as a result, she began to challenge the beliefs that she grew up with. She says, I began to experience all this myth-making as repulsive, page 136, and she goes on to say, why, and what do you mean, is what she would ask her parents. But these questions didn't seem to have been allowable in my home. Now, she said, I can't stop asking them. Page 141. So looking for something to engage her questions about the world, and questions her religious upbringing didn't allow her to ask, Armantrout has turned to science as an engine, as an exploration of reality, an expression of emotional catharsis. As she says in her article, Cosmology and Me, collected in Complete Prose, contemporary science not only gives us provocative things to imagine, but also leaves us with more questions than answers. Page 79. In this way, she turns to science not for definitive resolutions that simplify the world, but instead the resolutions that complicate the world and make it more complex. This way, science destabilizes meaning for Armantrout and becomes the engine of epiphany in her work, rather than the Buddhist religion that we find in Issa. And in her poem, Anchor, we find this beginning with the opening stanza, widely expected, if you will, a cataclysm. This is a statement pregnant with ambiguity, the quotation unanchored to a specific speaker or context, floating in space without referent. That if you will seems to undercut the seriousness of the third line, that single word, cataclysm. Widely expected, if you will, cataclysm, seems to suggest that this is in fact not a cataclysm at all, or if it is a cataclysm, only towards a single entity or thing that is being done to. And the poem continues in lines 4 to 7, explicating this first stanza. Things I'd say, am saying, to persons no longer present. The quotation, the stanza in stanza 1 has now been linked to the speaker of the poem. Along with this contextualization, however, there is an increased ambiguity of the circumstances of this phrase, with this curious doubling, things I'd say, am saying, both as something that she would say to persons no longer present, presumably if they were present here, as well as what she is saying at the current moment, both to herself and apostrophically to those no longer present. The word present here takes on a strange weight that the word often is not otherwise ascribed, although these persons could arguably be anywhere. It seems that no longer present suggests they are no longer present within this world at all. As such, the cataclysm, so casually referenced in line 1, now seems to refer to a death of some kind. And this is intensified and made more tangible by the circumstances of the poem's composition. In 2006, Ray Armantrout was diagnosed with adrenal cortical cancer, a cancer with a, quote, 5 to 15% 5-year survival rate, as she recounts in a 3-part article titled, A Cancer Patient Addresses Doctors, published on the medical nonprofit website Libba on November 6, 2011. Quote, in the months following my diagnosis, she explains, I tried to describe the experience, to say what it was like, in poetry. And although Ray Armantrout's surgery to remove her cancer was ultimately successful, and despite the very low survival rate she was initially given, she has had no reoccurrence of the adrenal cancer. These poems are still written with the fatalistic certainty that she is approaching death. Like Issa's haiku, this autobiographical context, existing entirely exterior from the poem, creates this resonant secondary reading when read in connection to it. And in lines 8 to 10, yards away trim junipers make their customary bows. These lines seem to place the poem in a specific domestic setting, the poet's own suburban backyard, the first chance we've had now to have any sense of setting. But it's unclear to whom or why the trim juniper make their customary bows. It seems this use of pathetic fallacy, perhaps the most Baroque device that Armantrout allows herself to employ, implies the universe is bowing to this universal truth, this truth of death, this truth of her own impending death. The bowing of nature to the natural, inevitable progression of life and death seems spiritually connected to what W.S. Merwin describes in the poem On the Anniversary of My Death, in his poetry collection, The Lice, the speaker bowing, not knowing to what. Provocatively, however, this transcendent meaning seems to be denied in the very next couplet. Oh, no thank you to any of it. As if death is a free sample offered to you from a mall kiosk you can politely decline as you pass by. Although this line gains its power from its seeming dismissal of death, in fact, it serves to amplify death's presence within the poem by a recognition of the absurdity and impossibility of this action, the impossibility that any of us can casually say, no thank you, to our own mortality. And yet, the poem does seem to offer this very answer in the final 2 couplets. If you watch me from increasing distance, I am writing this, always. William Shakespeare was assured of the immortality of literature, and more arrogantly in the immortality of his own sonnets, when he wrote in the final couplet of Sonnet 18, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, So long lives this, and this gives life to thee.